Hi, this is Scott with the Android Guys podcast. I'm sitting here with Luke.
Hey,
What's going on, dude?
not much, man.
So, we're doing a little retrospective look at Android.
A little trip down memory lane.
It's a longer trip than I thought it was going to be.
Right?
We go back further than I might be happy to admit.
Especially with looking around at what else was going on in the world at these times.
Yeah, man, it feels like two different timelines.
Yeah.
When you think of like Android and the devices and what things were in the mobile space seem to kind of exist at a different timeline or move at a different rate than what was going on in pop culture.
Yeah.
And what we were doing at the time of our lives.
Sure.
So that's what we're doing this, I guess you would call it season,
Yeah.
for the Android Guys podcast. This is our second episode for this one. So what we're doing is each episode we will dedicate time to the main features or specifications, functions of Android at the time as they were introduced to the world or with devices. And then we're also kind of highlighting a couple of particular devices of the day.
Yeah.
And maybe contrasting that with, comparing it with some of today's stuff. And then we'll also talk maybe a little bit about some apps at the time that were popular. And then, of course, to kind of drive it all home and make some of us feel older than others, we'll kind of highlight some of that pop culture stuff we talked about. So this is the Android 1.5 release, commonly known as
Cupcake.
Cupcake. It was an interesting thing. I remember when they announced that it was coming out, to have it called Cupcake was really cool.
Yeah.
It's like,
it was different. Nobody else was doing something like that.
and it was kind of like, I get, it felt like a code name or a project name or something. I didn't know where it was, where they were headed from, that stance. And we wouldn't see for another generation or two how they were actually naming them. So this is, at the time, the first named release.
Yeah.
And it was, C, the letter C. The first couple of generations, and spoiler alert if you don't already know this, D was donut,
Yeah.
eclair, froyo. So we saw that kind of naming convention. Each one had its own letter.
Right.
Luke, what do you remember? Okay, so let's set the table here. This is released in late April 2009.
Yeah.
27th. What do you remember about that time period? Do you remember what was going on in TV or movies or,
Yeah. So, with the help of the interwebs, we there were some very notable things around this release. One being it was the series finale of ER.
It was still on TV. I can't believe it was still on TV.
Right. So,
wow.
And then equally as perplexing was Parks and Rec debuted at that time.
Man. And that's come and gone.
Yep.
And been syndicated and moved to streaming.
And then this one, I still feel like this is off. I don't believe it because it was 2009 was so long ago. Late Night with Jimmy Fallon debuted.
Yeah, no. False.
Yeah. No. James Fallon took the late night desk.
No.
That makes no sense to me. We're recording this in 2001 now? Or 2021?
Our timelines are really screwed up.
That's 12 years ago?
12, 13 years.
He's been the late night host for that long.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't seem right.
So, I'll pivot to movies.
Yeah.
We're now, as if today, Fast and the Furious 9 is in the theater.
Yeah.
Fast and Furious number 4 was released at this time.
Okay.
So there have been 5 more Fast and Furious films since this arrival of Android. And at the time, there was a Hannah Montana movie. This is before...
Yeah.
This is before
Okay.
she became like full-fledged Miley Cyrus
and-
on her own, shed herself of that.
Right.
You know.
No Wrecking Ball. This
Yeah.
was before all that fun stuff.
Still television, like moved to movies.
Wow.
And then one of my favorite movies, maybe ever,
Okay.
Watchmen, came
Yeah.
out right around that
Okay.
time. So that's, for some people, when they look at these, they think, holy crap, that's a long time ago.
Right.
And then there are parts of us that look at that and go, well, that still feels like yesterday.
Right.
So, yeah, that's where movies were.
Yeah. And then if you move into music, the songs that were on the Billboard top during this time are just laughable at this point.
Don't do it.
Poker Face. Poker Face by Lady Gaga.
Boo.
Right Round by Flo Rida. And Boom Boom Pow from the Black Eyed Peas. That was our music of the day.
That was a time
around
period.
Cupcake release.
That was a whole time period, man. There's like, ugh.
That's what do the kids say these days? That's a total vibe, right?
You can't say stuff like that on this show.
No, I know.
You could say it, you can't get away with it.
No, I'm not trying to get away with it. That I feel gross saying it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the world that was going on during the Cupcake release, end of April 2009.
At the time, we were about a year and a half into running the website, so Android was everything and had started picking up speed for me, covering things because, at one point I was able to kind of keep up with everything just in my spare time on breaks and weekends and, my son's in bed. I mean, he's, 5 or 6 and, wife's watching TV, taking a shower. I'm going to go hop on the computer and see what's going on in the Android space.
Sure.
You could keep up with everything.
Yeah.
So at this point, we started to, we were about 5-6 months into the release of the T-Mobile G1.
Yep.
So it was going to see a software update. And then we started to get into the slow onslaught of new devices.
Right.
This is where the MyTouch 3G and then some of the other, HTC Hero and other phones started to hit the market and go, okay, Android's a real thing.
Right.
More than one device has it.
Yeah. You started seeing the names that we had seen in the Open Handset Alliance go, okay, here's our device.
Yes. And that was an interesting time because then you start to see like the delivering on the promises of we're working together. These are things that are coming out. Now it's, it's no longer wait and see.
Right.
We saw that from developers still wondering, well, do I want to write this app for one phone, one device? But it was really just kind of like, okay, Android's getting ready to take off. And now with the Android 1.0 moving into this 1.5 release, hey, we've got some things that we realize weren't quite ready or that we've kind of baked a little bit further and put into the platform. Luke, I've long held this idea, and I've probably told you that, when you look at all these other versions of Android that are C, D, E, and people wonder why there was no A or B, I've always felt like they were alpha and beta.
Yeah.
And they were not officially, known that way.
Yeah.
But I think, whatever was kind of given to developers early and then right before the G1 came out, like that was still considered beta stuff.
Sure.
And then the 1.0 is we are consumer ready. We loved Android 1. We loved everything that it did in 1.5. But if we're being honest and looking back and telling the truth with ourselves, it still felt like we were playing with beta software.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of the idea of just put it out and iterate,
Yep.
They were to a point where, hey, this is stable and people can use it. Let's put it out there. We'll get some feedback, have them beta test a little bit, or post beta test, and then we'll have, 1.5 as our full, like, this is kind of what we can do.
And so that's one of the reasons we're doing this series, is to kind of look at where Android was and what was being added into it. And that's kind of like the meat on the bones here. So these are things that, we take for granted on our devices today, that we can do X with our phone, that we can do Y, it's in our pocket, Z, I can do it in real time.
It's always been able to do this.
So these examples of all these things, some people grew up or came of age using their first smartphone, don't realize there was a real struggle prior to that where, man, I couldn't do this with my phone.
Yeah.
Or, wow, I could finally do this. So let's talk about some of the specifics. Now, Android, for those who really don't pay too close of attention to the big releases, a lot of it is developer facing. A lot of it is not something that consumers are going to see on the surface. A lot of it is not glamorous. So what we try to do is pull out some of the things that we think are more interesting and notable.
Sure.
So that's what we'll talk about here. Luke, what were some of the features that Android added to the platform at the 1.5 release?
In looking at this list, it is funny because just like you said, some of these are like, okay, if you know, then it's cool. But then other ones, it's like, wow, this was the first time you could video record.
Yeah,
you could record a video, and then even after that, you recorded your video. You could view it on your device, but then you could upload it to YouTube. So
that's something that, we live in a world today where anybody and everybody can be a social media star, an influencer, a YouTube vlogger, anything.
Right.
There was a point, like, right at this level where it was like, now you can do that.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, these videos that we're recording, they're not HD. These are like 320 by 480.
Right.
Really basic, but it's the idea of, it's like proof of concept.
Right.
You could do these things.
Yeah. Everybody can do these things.
Yeah. And I do have one video that I uploaded, I remember, and it's still online. It's a private video, but it was just my son running around in the backyard, and I recorded it with the G1.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was super cool to watch on my phone and be able to say, I shot that.
Yeah.
Here on this device. It looks so bad today.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to know what's going on to actually make out what's going on. But yeah, and then I just had a graduation party for this kid.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's
been a long
it's been a long journey. Yeah. So what else did
So you could record a video, you could upload it to YouTube. There was copy and paste in the browser.
So if you wanted to edit a website, or if you want to copy from an email, you can paste it into the browser.
Right.
And do that instead of...
Yeah, you could pull up an email, copy the link for the email, and then paste it.
Which is really... You don't even think about that being like a thing.
Right.
You just... It does.
Yeah.
That's what phones do.
Right.
But there was a point where you couldn't paste in a browser.
Right.
Ugh, what a weird...
I know. So strange.
Man.
Well, and browser... I mean, just the browser on the phone, this is what we talked about in the first episode. That was still so new. It was a full HTML browser.
Right. It was the internet everywhere.
Yeah, it wasn't just, a WAP page.
Right.
And you could really get in and do more things on the web browser, which needed a copy and paste.
Yeah. And there were, at that time, the browser wasn't even Chrome. It was just, it was HTML full browsing. But even a website, you would have to scroll left and right, up and down to kind of get to see that.
Right.
Nothing was optimized for mobile.
No.
We live in a world now where more than half of all the content people consume is done from their phone.
Right.
That's where a lot of people are getting their first taste of internet is through the phone.
Yeah.
Man, that's crazy to think that was, 2009 as we look back, feels like forever ago, but in the big scheme of things, 12, 13 years?
Yeah, that's not that long.
Yeah, that you couldn't do that. So,
and then you had, the other stuff that was interesting, was needed, but it wasn't stuff that maybe everybody understood was a new feature. So things like third-party virtual keyboards.
yeah.
You could get into, a little bit more better look and feel. You could, there's a couple keyboards that had changed around the view for QWERTY a little bit, a little bit easier to type on.
Well, and that was one of the things that really hooked us on the idea of Android is we're going to release a device with this keyboard. If you don't like it, you're not stuck with it.
Yeah.
That was the whole whoa, I have choice.
Yeah.
Open source software. I could code one if I needed to, but I can download another one from the Play Store or the Android market at the time.
Market, yeah.
But that was really where you start to see the idea of I can really customize my phone, and the keyboard is one of those things where you're in it all day, whether it's text or email or web browsing or anything, you're constantly. So if you didn't like the one that came with it, and let's be honest, it was, gray and black. It was okay.
Yeah.
It served its purpose, but there were other ones that came about that somebody might just want to say, I like mine to have orange.
Right.
Or I want mine to have this high contrast.
Right.
So it's easier for me to see. Where today, even the Gboard or the Google keyboard has tons of features built into it to keep you from, not keep you, but to allow you to customize it without having to go for a third-party app.
Right. Which you still can do.
Oh, yeah. And there are some really nice ones out
there.
There are. My favorite feature, and I think that's what you were getting ready to do next, was support for widgets.
Yeah.
Which, for people today, we see them on our phones. A lot of, out of the box, you get your calendars, you've got your clocks, you've got your weather, and these things on the home screen.
Right.
These are widgets.
Yeah.
These are, these were something that Android had at 1.0, but it didn't have anything other than what Google provided.
Right. Yeah.
So a developer might make a to-do list, and then you have the ability to put a widget on your home screen to see that to-do list without having to go in and open an app. That was mind-blowing stuff.
Yes.
That was something that you look at your phone as an Android user and said, hey, you can't do this with that fancy iPhone. This is, I have much more robust operating system that lets me do so much more. And, for better or worse, there were fanboys on both sides of arguments saying, well, I like this about mine. And this is right when Android starts to do these releases where each thing that comes out, they were pretty revolutionary. And they were kind of ahead of the time. And then we would see Apple start to introduce some of those later and, make a big deal of some of those. But, yeah, the ability... it wasn't until just recently that Apple allowed for widgets.
Right.
It was always just desktop icons or shortcuts to apps.
Right.
So, widgets are a cool thing.
They are.
And that was one of the... I remember just about every app that I would install, I would look to see if it had a widget.
Yep.
And what did it let me do?
Yeah. So
that I don't have to open an app.
Yeah, there were times when widgets first were getting implemented by developers where my phone screen or multiple screens, swiping, I would have just widgets on widgets.
Yep.
And it was just,
because you could.
Because you could. Right?
Yeah. Ugly, cluttered.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were nice. Some developers would create these little things for Android that weren't in the platform,
right,
to allow you to do a quick access of, I'm going to silence my phone, I'm going to turn on my Wi-Fi. These things that you swipe down from your notification bar, that stuff didn't always exist.
Yeah, no, I definitely had a widget for a long time on my phone that was just turning a flashlight on.
Yep.
Turn the light on my camera.
Because when you actually had to install an app, remember all the flashlight apps?
Yeah.
And people asking me, which one's better? There were so many, ugh, man.
They all look like it looks like a flashlight that you just press down.
Yeah.
But then there was a widget for one. I remember it was awesome.
Yep. Some of the apps I remember at the time, Remember the Milk.
Yeah.
That was a big, the idea of, wait, I can actually just create a little shopping list and keep it on my phone.
Yeah.
And I don't have to do anything special. It's just, here's a digital one.
Right.
I can check it off as I buy my things.
Mm-hmm.
What a novel idea.
And I remember when that came out, we both used Remember the Milk for a while, and as more services became available, there were things like, and I might be jumping a little bit ahead in the timeline, but thinking about what Android could do in the future, and I remember us talking about, hey, when we could use Remember the Milk, and maybe when we're at the grocery store, it'll know our location, then ping us and say, hey, you have this on your Remember the Milk app. Don't forget to get it, and stuff like it just,
or time of day,
right? It just opened up so many possibilities.
Yeah.
And it was the fun time of thinking through this technology of like, how could this really impact my life?
Yep.
It was the first time my phone. It was the beginning. Not the first time, but I guess it was the beginning of now, everybody has our phone, and our phone is our lifeline, is the beginning of this thing can do it all for me.
And you didn't feel constrained by imagination either.
Right.
Like you just kind of, every little app that kind of came out at that time was kind of like a proof of concept of this could really be something cool.
Mm-hmm.
I remember not loving the look and feel.
Sure.
I settled with, or for some of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember thinking, man, I have this stuff at my disposal. It's on my home screen of my phone. I don't have to go anywhere to do this.
Yeah.
I can, when I want to turn on Wi-Fi, I can connect it just as quickly just by tapping this.
Mm-hmm.
If I need to, change my ringer settings or do anything that, those were much more flexible.
Sure.
One of the other apps that I remember at the time was Google Listen, which is now Google Podcasts,
sure.
But the idea of having podcasts, and those were really, at the time, just kind of taken off.
Yeah.
I mean, we recorded one, and we had one all the way back in 2007.
Yeah.
Recording, in a break room on a MP3 recorder player that,
General Mills, love you.
Yeah, so podcasts weren't really what they are today. And the idea of, for those who had them and had certain ones that they liked, they could, put their podcast, and you would have to know the RSS feeds.
Yes, right?
At the time, you'd have to find that from their website and paste that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always been a fan of what Google would put out app-wise.
Sure.
Even though they tend to cannibalize a lot of it or fail spectacularly and then move in a different direction. It was right around this time where it was just kind of like, okay, Google's throwing some pretty ambitious things out there. Really being able to upload to YouTube and name the video and to make it public without having to go sit at my computer, plug it in and tether it or anything. So very interesting. Let's talk briefly about some of the key phones of the day. Again, we're talking spring 2009. There were two that we had kind of written down here to talk about. One being the HTC Hero, which was not their first phone in the U.S. Definitely not their first Android, because they were behind the G1 and the MyTouch phones. But this is one for Sprint.
Yes.
And it was a unique one because it had its own user interface, HTC Sense.
Yeah.
And it looked completely different.
I remember seeing that phone because at this time I was working at T-Mobile. And I remember seeing that phone, and the thing that got me that was like, oh, I want Sense UI so bad, is when it would rain, if the weather widget was on, it was rain, there would be drops on your screen.
Yes.
And like a little windshield wiper that would come out of that widget.
Yes.
And it was like, that was revolutionary for, widgets in general were, but it just looked so cool. It looked a little bit more polished than regular Android UI.
Yeah.
And the other cool thing about that is it was the first buy-in from another carrier that we saw
right
in the U.S.
And Sprint was a founding member of the Open Handset Alliance. But we had seen some HTC phones, some Windows-based, Windows Mobile. It was nice to see that be so different. And I remember having lots of conversations at the time of, this is what Android is. It represents choice.
Yeah.
You don't want, AT&T, actually, was it Singular at the time still that the iPhone was?
I think it was around that time. Maybe it was either 9 or 2011 where they switched over to AT&T.
Either way, but if you wanted the iPhone, you had one carrier.
Yeah.
You want to do it, this is where you have to go.
Yep.
And I hated that idea.
Yep.
I completely, to this day, hate when, if you want something hardware-wise, that you have to go somewhere for the service. And what I liked about Android was it represented the choice. You can buy a computer and then pick your internet provider.
Right.
Buy your phone at the provider you want. This is
Right.
before unlocked phones, of course.
Yeah. Everything was still subsidized.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the HTC Hero. I have some of the specifications here. This phone was about $180 with a 2-year contract. So we were still doing that $180, $200.
Sure.
Most phones were $200. Some of the key phones, BlackBerry, iPhone, but this, I think, $180 was just kind of like that. We can undercut it a little bit, introduce this thing.
A little cheaper to get more people to buy into this idea.
Yeah. It was released in June 2009, and the HTC Hero, if you remember, was similar to the G1 in that it had the screen with the trackball below it, and it had that little bit of a chin that jutted out. Just a really cool looking phone.
It was.
It was unlike the slab that you come to expect and
Right.
see today. Now, if you flip that thing over on its face, it had like a kind of like a tent kind of thing, but very cool little device. This thing had a 3.2-inch display. Yeah, so that's about half the size screen-wise of what some of today's bigger phones can get. 320 by 480 pixels.
Okay.
So not even HD. I mean, we're still at that point.
Yep.
It had a Qualcomm processor, and this is very common of the time, 528 megahertz CPU. And we'll talk about another device of that day. The 528 seemed to be what a lot of manufacturers, the industry didn't move at the speed it did, or that it does today. So pair that thing with 288 megabytes of RAM, and then 512 megabyte internal storage. So you're looking at a half a gigabyte. Now that thing had a micro SD card, and that was another thing that I really liked about devices is you weren't confined to the storage space.
Right.
Couple of other features. This had a removable battery, 1350 milliamp hours, and it came in like a graphite black color. It also came in white, which looked really cool. And that was a whole thing at the time, was phones that weren't black.
Right.
People were excited to get a phone that was white.
Right.
It also came in brown.
Yeah.
And it also came in pink.
Yeah.
So in select markets, you could find this thing that really just looked really interesting. I loved it. I loved the phones of the time. I loved the trackball. It was just it looked polished. Even like the icons and things, they weren't the same. So they did, and that's a whole other conversation.
Sure.
When you talk about, custom skins of changing the way a phone looks, because, that slows down the rate at which software updates were issued.
Yep.
Because you had to have the phone maker on board, make some changes. Then you had to have the carrier on board as well. So there were plenty of cases where a phone would come out and be a year and a half behind a software update if it ever saw one. So that was an Android 1.5 phone with Sense UI. 5 megapixel camera on that thing. Headphone jack, something we kind of took for granted or take for granted now.
Sure.
That it has that. Bluetooth 2.0. So, I mean, you're very, very basic things at the time were considered pretty revolutionary. Built-in compass. Accelerometer, so your phone knew. I remember it had a game on it that you could play where you were trying to like roll the phone around to get a ball to kind of like follow a maze and stay out of the holes. But your phone knew how to interpret that because of the accelerometer and the gyroscopes and things.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first time I think I'd ever used the word accelerometer in my vocabulary.
Yeah, right. Had to remember, does it end in METE? Or is it accelerom? How do I spell that? Because I'm going to have to use this word a lot.
Yeah.
And then the other device that was also key, something that really was a sign of things to come.
Sure.
Was the Samsung Galaxy.
Yes.
This isn't the Galaxy S.
No, it's not an S phone.
This is the Galaxy.
Yes.
And this one came out in April 2009. Man, do you remember what this thing looked like?
Yeah.
It's got the little buttons down at the bottom, the D-pad. It was great because it was so different.
Yep.
But it was also not the most beautiful thing.
No.
But it had physical hard buttons for like a D-pad, up and down, left, right. You have your call, send, and end.
Yeah.
And you also have your back button.
Yeah. So it was. So, but I think back when those smartphones were coming out, right? It had the look of a dumb phone. So it was a little bit. The thing that was cool about it, the thing that was cool about that design, is it felt a little dated, but it was cool because the people that were not used to a smartphone could pick it up and feel comfortable.
Right. Yeah.
They weren't wondering. If you handed somebody a G1, I remember they would look at it and go, "What do I do?"
Yeah. It kind of like how do I work this?
Yeah.
Okay. It's too many things going on here.
Right.
Do I have to flip the screen out?
Right.
Do I have to use the trackball? When do I use this?
Right. And so the design of the Galaxy was a little bit of an easing into the smartphone idea for people, and I think that was a smart choice. But it had some of the same specs that we saw on the Hero. It had the 528 megahertz CPU. It had a 3.2 inch screen. So 320 by 480, a 5 megapixel camera with flash. Had the headphone jack.
Interestingly enough, it had less memory.
Yeah.
But it had a whole lot more storage.
Right.
You're looking at 128 megabytes of RAM.
Sure.
But it had 8 gigabytes, which took, you're looking at 16 times the storage capacity of the Hero.
Right.
So that was just, I remember seeing that thinking, that can't be right.
Right. Well, and so, MP3 players were still a thing. So it was the idea of, hey, you can put your music on your phone and listen to it, and you have all this space for more music. Had a little bit better a battery than the Hero. It was a 1500 milliamp battery. And then the other thing was it to pair with, the music idea was Spotify beta.
Yeah, that I remember the headlines and covering it as in it's coming to the US.
Yeah.
And it's available and you can sign up for the beta, and Spotify is massive now.
Right.
But wow. What a time, man.
Right?
Yeah, so that was the Galaxy before the Galaxy S, and that became its own other, I think, topic we could dive into, the covering some of the Galaxy S devices or Galaxy series. But and one other thing to kind of point out at the time is these phones were using mini USB, and I remember that the Galaxy had a micro USB.
Yeah.
So we started to move into this like, oh, hey, there's actually a better way to do this.
Yeah.
One of the problems we had with phones was you have to unplug it to plug in your headphones because it uses this adapter. Things started to move into a little bit more cooler, like sophisticated. Oh, Samsung, they're a player. I'm familiar with Samsung. They've been making phones for years, and I don't know HTC. I'm not familiar with them.
Right.
So it was kind of like, oh, this is a big player.
Yeah, it was more broad adoption.
Yeah. So that was Samsung Galaxy, and that was also priced. I don't have the information here, but I believe that was also right around $200.
Yeah.
That's just seemed to be the going rate with doing a smartphone at the time.
Right.
Carriers would absorb the extra $300 of the cost as long as you subscribe to their service.
Sure.
Luke, anything else that you wanted to touch on here before we wrap up? I know this was, semi-exhaustive look at some of the stuff without, really breaking things down, but any last thoughts?
Not really, no. I mean, I think we gave a pretty good snapshot of what that was like when it came out, and just we're starting to see now in even just the first main release, if we can call 1.5 the first main release, we're starting to see the phones we know now.
Yeah, and one of the things that we may touch on a little bit more as we move into the other versions, the limitations that Android had, the handset makers started to have workarounds and do their own stuff, and that was kind of like this Open Handset Alliance was kind of like, well, hey, we're all going to work together for a common cause,
right.
Share information with each other, and kind of work to make phones a different thing.
We found this way to do this.
Yeah, so that was something that, if you looked at a phone and thought, well, how did they do this? How was the HTC Hero on Sprint when Android didn't have CDMA support built into it? That was something that they had to go about and do specifically because it's not until the next release of Android that Android has CDMA support built into the platform.
Right.
So at this point, you're talking about Sprint and or HTC working on that to say, okay, we can make this work. I don't know how, flexible it's going to work. I mean, you remember back in the day, there were tons and tons of apps that would give you this forced close error.
Yes.
So we don't know how much of that stuff was because it wasn't Android as it was intended, or Android wasn't ready.
Sure.
Because, well, Samsung did this or HTC did that, and that's causing this to conflict. Right. So that's right. We're about to take off. The rocket's, about to launch here real soon. So I think that's going to do it for me.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for listening. This is the Android Guys podcast, and we did a retroactive deep dive into Android 1.5 Cupcake. Next week's episode, we're going to talk about Android 1.6, which is Donut, which follows quickly on the heels.
Yeah.
We're only talking a couple months, so thanks for listening.